This is Stalag Luft III, 145 kilometers southeast of Berlin, constructed between 1942 and 1944, one of the largest prisoner of war camps in Europe. At its peak, between 10,000 and 12,000 Allied airmen were held within these fences. Officers, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, men shot down over Axis-occupied territory and brought here to wait out the war. The Germans designed it to be escape-proof. Double fencing topped with barbed wire, guard towers equipped with machine guns and searchlights, a warning wire that triggered immediate execution if crossed, seismic microphones buried underground to detect tunneling, buildings raised off to expose any digging beneath them. On the night of March 24, 1944, 76 men crawled through a tunnel that was not supposed to exist. 3 reached freedom. 50 were murdered. This is how they did it. And this is what happened after. Stalag Luft III was operated by the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. This distinction mattered. The men who ran the camp were pilots. The men inside it were pilots. Between captor and captive existed a degree of professional respect that would not have been present in facilities run by the SS or the Wehrmacht's ground forces. The northern compound where our story takes place housed officers from the Royal Air Force and other Allied air services. Their rank afforded them privileges unavailable to enlisted prisoners elsewhere in the Reach. A well-stocked library, a makeshift theater that hosted films and live performances, a sports field, even a small swimming pool during summer months. By the standards of wartime imprisonment, conditions were tolerable. None of this diminished the desire to escape. The prisoners couldn't know how long they would remain captive. The war's outcome was uncertain, its duration unknowable. To accept imprisonment was to surrender autonomy, to exist in a state of indefinite suspension where nothing was within their control. Escape offered purpose, it offered defiance, and it served the Allied war effort directly. Every escape attempt that forced the Germans to allocate manpower and equipment to prevention or pursuit was a small victory. Resources spent hunting escaped prisoners were resources not spent on the front lines. The problem was the security apparatus designed to prevent exactly that. The compound's perimeter consisted of 2 parallel fences, each topped with barbed wire, with additional wire coiled between them. 30 meters of open ground separated the outer fence from the tree line. Anyone attempting to cross this space would be visible to multiple guard towers simultaneously. The overlapping fields of fire left no blind spots. Approaching the fences was itself a death sentence. A low warning wire ran around the compound's interior. Any prisoner who stepped over it would be shot without warning. The guards in the towers had standing orders, no questions, no hesitation. The Germans had anticipated tunneling. The camp had been deliberately constructed on sandy soil. The material was unstable, prone to collapse. Tunneling through it without causing a cave-in required engineering expertise and construction materials the prisoners did not possess. Sensitive seismic microphones had been placed underground around the entire perimeter. The slightest vibration from digging would register on monitoring equipment inside the guard stations. Every hut in the compound stood on short stilts, raised several inches off the ground. Guards could see beneath them. There was nowhere to begin a tunnel without being observed. The camp also employed specialists. They were called ferrets. Their sole responsibility was to detect escape attempts. They entered the compound unannounced, searched huts without warning, listened to conversations, and watched for any behavior that might indicate planning. Colonel Friedrich von Lindener commanded Stalag Luft III. Under his watch, not a single successful escape had occurred from the northern compound. The prisoners intended to change that. In April 1943, the escape committee made a decision. They would build not one tunnel, but 3. The reasoning was strategic. If the Germans discovered one, they might relax their vigilance, believing they had found the escape route. If they discovered 2, they would almost certainly not suspect a 3rd. The tunnels were given code names Tom, Dick, and Harry. What emerged over the following year was not merely an escape attempt. It was an industrial operation. Approximately 600 prisoners participated in some capacity. Diggers, engineers, security personnel, forgers, tailors, scroungers, who procured materials through theft or bribery. Each man had a role. The organization functioned with military precision beneath the constant threat of discovery. Harry, the tunnel that would ultimately be used, ran from Hut 104. Its entrance was concealed beneath a heavy metal cooking stove that sat atop a wooden trapdoor. The stove could be lifted by a system of ropes and pulleys, revealing a vertical shaft that dropped into darkness. The tunnel extended 111 meters from entrance to exit. It ran 7.6 meters underground, deep enough to avoid the seismic microphones that had been placed closer to the surface. At that depth, the sandy soil required constant reinforcement to prevent collapse. This presented a problem the prisoners had anticipated. Construction materials could not be smuggled into the camp in meaningful quantities. The solution was to acquire them from the Germans themselves. Bedboards began to vanish. Chairs were reported broken and requisitioned for replacement. Tables collapsed mysteriously. Under the terms of the Geneva Conventions, enforced by neutral inspectors from the Red Cross in Switzerland, the Germans were obligated to maintain minimum standards of living for prisoners. When furnishings disappeared, they had to be replaced. The bedboards became tunnel supports. The wood was cut, shaped, and fitted into place along the walls and ceiling to prevent cave-ins. Screws harvested from light fittings and furniture joints were used to affix everything together. Colonel von Lindheiner noted with confusion that material consumption in the compound had reached 5 times the normal rate for equivalent German military facilities. He did not know that his prisoners were dismantling their living quarters to build an underground railway. The tunnel was too long for efficient movement on hands and knees. A rail system was constructed from wooden boards with carved grooves. A small cart, barely large enough to hold a man lying flat, traveled along these rails. Ropes allowed operators at either end to pull the cart forward or backward. Tools and sand moved one direction. Diggers moved the other. Lighting came from the camp's own electrical system. Wires were tapped and run the length of the tunnel, powering small bulbs at intervals. Fresh air was pumped through a ventilation system built from kit bags, connected by stolen piping. A bellows mechanism, operated by hand, pushed air to the working face, where diggers labored in conditions that would otherwise have been fatal. Then there was the sand. Tunneling displaced enormous quantities of it. The sand beneath the camp was bright yellow. The soil on the surface was gray. The pile of yellow sand anywhere in the compound would immediately reveal that digging was underway. More than 100 men were assigned to dispersal. They were called penguins, named for the way they walked while carrying their cargo. Each penguin wore trouser legs, fitted with long bags that hung inside, reaching to the ankle. A pin at the bottom could be pulled to release the contents. The penguins filled their bags with yellow sand, walked into the compound's courtyard, and released it slowly while appearing to stroll casually. As the sand fell, they kicked at the ground, mixing the yellow with the gray topsoil. Over the course of months, tons of excavated earth was dispersed in plain sight. Security within the compound operated continuously. Watchmen tracked the movements of every guard, every ferret. A network of signals allowed instant communication across the camp. When a ferret entered a hut, diggers in the tunnel received warning within seconds. The stove would be lowered, the trapdoor concealed. By the time a search began, there was nothing to find. In September 1943, the ferrets found Tunnel Tom. The discovery came during a period of heightened vigilance. A routine search uncovered the entrance, ending months of work. Shortly afterward, the American prisoners in the northern compound were transferred to a separate facility. The Germans had determined that the British and Americans were cooperating too effectively. Thick was suspended. Its entrance was used to store excavated sand. All remaining effort was concentrated on Harry. The tunnel had to be ready by spring, when weather conditions would give escapees the best chance of survival outside the camp. While diggers worked below ground, another team prepared for what would come after. Escape kits were assembled for each man selected to go. The forgers produced identity documents, work permits, travel passes, letters of employment. The papers had to withstand inspection by German officials who examined such documents daily. Every stamp, every signature, every fold had to be authentic. Tailors converted blankets and uniforms into civilian clothing: suits, overcoats, hats. A man emerging from a forest in RAF uniform would be arrested immediately. A man in a worker's clothes might pass unnoticed. Maps were copied by hand from originals obtained through bribery. Compasses were constructed from magnetized needles mounted in melted phonograph records. German currency was accumulated slowly, bartered from guards who could be convinced to part with marks in exchange for chocolate, coffee, and cigarettes from Red and cross parcels. By March 1944, the tunnel was complete. The escape kits were ready. 200 men had been selected. The date was set for the night of March 24th. March 24th, 1944. Sunset fell at approximately 9:00 p.m. Sunrise would come at 5:30 the following morning. The escapees had 8.5 hours of darkness. 200 men had been selected to make the attempt. The first 30 were those with the best chance of remaining undetected. Men fluent in German. Men with the most convincing documents. Men whose cover stories could withstand interrogation. They would receive whatever cash had been accumulated and a head start to reach Saigon's train station before the last train departed. The remaining 170 would travel on foot. Each man carried a separate travel plan, most intended to reach neutral countries, then Allied territory. Some aimed for Switzerland, others for Sweden via the Baltic coast. A few hoped to reach France and link with resistance networks. Throughout the day, final preparations were made. Clothing was fitted. Documents were distributed. Travel routes were reviewed. Inside Hut 104, tension accumulated with every passing hour. At 8:45 p.m., the first men descended the entrance shaft and took positions inside the tunnel. They lay flat on the wooden trolleys, spaced at intervals along the 111-meter passage. Their job was to operate the rope system, pulling each escapee forward toward the exit. The conditions were suffocating. The tunnel measured approximately 60 centimeters by 60 centimeters. Room enough to lie prone, not room enough to turn around. The air, despite the ventilation system, was thick with the smell of earth and sweat and fear. At 9:30, the lead man reached the exit shaft and began removing the boards that concealed the opening to the surface. The boards had been in place for weeks, undisturbed. They were waterlogged, swollen, jammed tight against each other. He worked in near total darkness. Every sound risked detection. Above him, guards walked their patrols. The boards would not move. 10:15 p.m., 45 minutes after he began, the boards finally came free. Almost an hour of darkness had been lost. Then came the second problem. The tunnel had been calculated to emerge inside the tree line, where escaping men would have immediate cover. When the exit was opened, it became clear that the calculation had been wrong. The shaft emerged several meters short in the open ground between the forest and the camp's outer perimeter. Guards patrolled this area regularly. The escape committee faced a choice: abandon the attempt and seal the tunnel, preserving it for a future date, or proceed with the plan, accepting the additional risk. They chose to proceed. A rope was run from the exit shaft to the edge of the tree line. A watchman positioned himself in a surveillance nest the Germans had constructed to observe the camp from the forest. When the patrol passed, he would tug the rope twice. The signal would travel down into the tunnel, all clear. At 10:30, the first man emerged. He pulled himself from the shaft, pressed his body against the cold earth, and waited. The rope tugged. He crawled forward, reached the tree line, and vanished into the forest. The second man followed, then the third, then the fourth. For the next 6 hours, the rhythm continued. Men emerged from the ground at irregular intervals, timed to the gaps between patrols. Some moved quickly, others slowly, their nerves fraying with each second spent in the open. The rope system worked. The watchman's signals were reliable. The guards noticed nothing. By 4:00 a.m., 73 men had escaped. The process was slower than planned, but it was working. At the current rate, another 20 or 30 might make it before dawn. 4:55 a.m., 35 minutes before sunrise. The 77th man felt the rope move. He interpreted it as the all-clear signal. He began to pull himself from the shaft. He emerged directly in front of a German patrol guard. The guard froze. For a long second, neither man moved. Then the guard raised his rifle, fired a warning shot into the air, and blew his whistle. The sound carried across the compound and into the forest. Searchlights swept toward the tree line. More guards converged on the position. The escape was over. 76 men had made it out. 124 remained in the tunnel or the compound. The alarm spread through Stalag Luft III within minutes. By dawn, the search had begun. The manhunt that followed was one of the largest in German history. Between 60,000 and 70,000 Wehrmacht troops and Gestapo personnel were mobilized. Railway stations were watched. Roads were patrolled. Border crossings were reinforced. The Reich's security apparatus, already stretched thin by the demands of a two-front war, now devoted enormous resources to finding 76 escaped prisoners. The issue approached 1,000 German personnel for every escapee. Most of the men were recaptured within days. Some were caught before they left Sagan, picked up at the train station or on roads leading from the town. Others made it further, traveling for days or weeks before a checkpoint. A suspicious innkeeper or simple bad luck ended their journey. The tunnel's discovery had doomed them. Had the escape continued undetected until morning, more men would have made it out, and the search would have begun hours later. Instead, the alarm was raised while most escapees were still within easy reach. 3 men evaded capture entirely. Per Bergsland and Jens Muller, both Norwegian, reached the port of Stettin on the Baltic coast. From there, they stowed away on a Swedish freighter and reached neutral territory. They were free. Bram van der Stok, a Dutch pilot, traveled south through Germany and into the Netherlands, where he made contact with resistance forces. From there, he moved through Belgium and France, crossed into Spain, and eventually reached Gibraltar. He was the only escapee to reach Allied lines by an overland route, 3 out of 76, a success rate of 4%. The remaining 73 were in German custody. What happened next was not a military matter. It was murder. Over the following weeks, the recaptured prisoners began to disappear. No transfer orders were issued. No documentation was filed. Men who had been in Gestapo custody simply ceased to exist in any official record. Their fellow prisoners at Stalag Luft III heard nothing. The Germans offered no information. Then the urns began to arrive. 50 of them, each containing ashes, each accompanied by a death certificate stating that the prisoner had been shot while attempting to escape. 50 men, the same cause of death, the same circumstances. The explanation was implausible on its face. A Swiss inspector visiting the camp immediately reported his suspicions to the British government. Something had happened that the Germans were attempting to conceal. The prisoners knew their comrades had been killed. They did not know how. The truth emerged after the war. A Royal Air Force investigation launched immediately after Germany's surrender pieced together what had occurred. Surviving Gestapo personnel were interrogated. Documents were recovered. Witnesses were located. The picture that emerged was systematic execution disguised as combat death. The recaptured prisoners were told they were being returned to Stalag Luft III. They were loaded into vehicles and driven along rural roads. At some point during the journey, the vehicle would stop. The prisoner would be invited to step outside to relieve himself. He would be handcuffed. He would turn his back. He would be shot in the back of the head. His body would fall into the ditch beside the road. The location changed. The weapon sometimes varied. The method was consistent. 50 men died this way. The order had come from the highest levels of the Nazi government. Adolf Hitler, reportedly furious at the embarrassment the escape had caused, authorized the executions personally. The Gestapo implemented his directive with bureaucratic efficiency. Under the laws of war, this was a crime. Prisoners of war could not be executed for attempting to escape. The Geneva Conventions, which Germany had signed, were explicit on this point. What the Gestapo did was murder. The Nuremberg trials convened after the war to prosecute German leadership for crimes against humanity included the Stalag Luft, the third murders among their charges. The RAF investigation had identified the Gestapo personnel directly responsible for the killings. Those who could be found were arrested. Those who had died during the war's final months escaped justice. The defendants offered the same defense that echoed through every war crimes proceeding. They had followed orders. The orders had come from above. Responsibility lay with the leadership, not with the men who pulled the triggers. The tribunal rejected this argument. Following an illegal order did not absolve the one who followed it. Guilty verdicts were returned. Sentences ranged from lengthy imprisonment to death by hanging. Justice, such as it was, had been served. The Great Escape, as it came to be known, was not the largest prison break of World War II by numbers. Other escapes involved more men. Some succeeded more completely. What distinguished it was the scale of the organization, the sophistication of the engineering, and the magnitude of the German response. 600 men had participated in a clandestine industrial operation running beneath the camp, designed to make such an operation impossible. They had built railways and ventilation systems and forged documents and civilian clothing. They had dispersed 130 tons of sand in plain sight. They had done all of this while under constant surveillance by specialists whose sole purpose was to detect exactly this kind of activity. For a month after the escape, tens of thousands of German personnel were occupied with the manhunt. Military resources were diverted from the front lines. The Reich's attention was divided at a moment when division was a vulnerability it could not afford. The prisoners had set out to escape, die trying, or inconvenience the Germans to such a degree that it would affect the war effort. They succeeded. The executions were intended as a deterrent. A message was disseminated through every prisoner of war camp in occupied Europe. Escape is no longer a sport. The implication was clear. Anyone who attempted to follow would meet the same fate. The threat failed. Almost as soon as the surviving prisoners at Stalag left, the Third learned what had happened to their comrades. They began planning another tunnel. The desire for freedom proved stronger than the fear of death. It always would. 76 men crawled through a tunnel that should not have existed, built by an organization that should not have been possible, inside a prison designed to prevent exactly what they achieved. 3 reached freedom. 50 were murdered for trying. The ones who remained started digging again.